My name is Dr. Miro Griffiths. I am a research fellow in disability studies at the University of Leeds, and I also hold several advisory positions on disability policy to the UK Government and European Commission. I have always been opposed to assisted suicide, and many disabled people I speak to who are conscious of the social injustices encountered by disabled people's communities have been against assisted suicide. Disabled people are denied opportunities to seek education, to participate in the labour market if they want to be protected if they can't participate in the labour market, to have an active and valued role in society and in their communities. When you see all these struggles being encountered by disabled people, the premise of having a program to effectively end somebody's life because of the assumed suffering or intolerable situations that they are in, this creates a real dangerous and toxic situation, I think, when you start to assemble all these different components together. Rather than spend our time and effort thinking about injustice, thinking about the injustice of healthcare services and so on, we should be focusing primarily on support for disabled people to live the life that they want. We are talking about a community who are being oppressed and marginalised due to the way society is organised. The effective response of addressing disabled people's marginalisation is not to produce mechanisms where their death can be accelerated or their death can be encouraged due to authoritative and influential bodies and individuals. Instead, you look for mechanisms that can help produce accessible and inclusive and participatory communities. And you do that alongside effective programs of health provision and treatment that can best support you as your body changes, and whether that includes deterioration, then so be it. I have deep concerns about legislating for assisted suicide. One of those reasons is because it would fundamentally alter and overhaul the way in which we view the role of medical professionals. If you were to involve a process of assisted suicide, we are completely altering the relationship between medical professionals and individuals with health conditions and impairments. It creates a situation where there is always on the table now an opportunity or an offer for somebody's death to be facilitated and legitimised by legislative and policy processes. For me, this is deeply harmful for any community, but it's particularly harmful for disabled people because disabled people historically have always struggled to have their needs met. There is a concern, I think, within the disabled people's community that our attempts to realise accessibility and inclusion will stall or they will be reversed because more focus and emphasis will be placed on, well, you've always got this option to die, effectively. And when you start to look at the literature around the world, when you see countries that are offering assisted suicide as an alternative to struggling to access support mechanisms, struggling to access treatments and therapies, struggling to access sufficient frameworks to allow you to live the life that you want, when it becomes a permanent option on the table, there is no incentive then to continue the struggle and the hard work for building and realising and sustaining inclusive societies. As a disabled person who has had severe health impairments from birth, who has a physical impairment which requires the use of assistive technologies like wheelchairs, I required 24/7 support from healthcare professionals. I access therapies on a daily basis, medical equipment on a daily basis, access to hospitals and consultants regularly every month. When you've lived a life of that, you are exposed to the different judgments and values and expectations that surround you, whether that is from the state in terms of what it resources and what it funds, professionals who are involved in determining whether you should have access to support or not, and also the responses from communities, whether to say, is your life worth living or not? Often when I've gone into hospital, usually because my respiratory is declining and so on, the question that is often asked to my partner or to my family member or even to my personal assistants who provide me with 24-hour support, often the first question they're asked is, should we place a do not resuscitate notice on Miro's notes? So straight away you can see that the conversation is built upon the premise of, is this life worth saving? And when you then have periods throughout your life where there is extreme pressures on resources and infrastructures to deliver support, as there has often been when we think about health services in the UK, or when you look at something like a pandemic where rationing starts to occur and we are starting to question who gets priority over others for support and so on. Personally, I know that my life and the value that's placed on my life is questioned, it's debated, but it's always assumed to be quite low as well, the priority given to me. So if you introduce a mechanism of assisted suicide, you're effectively saying, on the one hand, we'll still debate whether your life is worth saving, but we're also always going to have this option on the table now, where your life can be ended. And for me, this is increasing the levels of anxiety felt by myself, but also by others in my community. As a disabled person who is permanently struggling to have their needs met and to be valued as a human being in society, alongside my role as a sociologist who questions how and why we organise societies in various ways, my feeling is that many people will opt for assisted suicide if it became available, but they do so on the basis that they are fed up with the struggles that they are occurring, that they are experiencing. They are so desperate to remove the injustices that they're experiencing that they will choose this option for death. And to me, that's not a good rationale for having the system in place. If people are choosing this because they are struggling in their life, and the evidence shows us, people choose it because of the fear of becoming a burden, the fear of losing agency, choice and control over their life, the changes in the way that they used to do things compared to what they may need to do now because their body has changed. For me, these are not good reasons for choosing assisted suicide, because in all those different examples, surely the focus and the emphasis should be on thinking about, well, how do we create a culture where people don't feel a burden when they require assistance? How do we create a society where people are provided with sufficient support so they can live the life that they want as their body changes? I recognize that my needs will change. I have a progressive condition. My muscle strength will deteriorate. My respiratory system will decline. But at no point do I wish to have an accelerated death because these feelings are intolerable. What I'm most concerned about is, as my needs change, as possibly my medical needs become more prevalent, do I have access to sufficient support so I can live the life that I want as these needs materialize and change and go in all different directions? That's what I'm focused on. Never once have I contemplated the idea that I want to have this option on the table. So I think that those who do want this option on the table, those who become so fixated on wanting assisted suicide, I just really hope that we could press pause and say, do we actually have the society that we want before we start contemplating introducing these new and arguably very hostile and violent mechanisms? Because that's what they are. Death is an abrupt experience. Death can be a very violent experience as well, particularly when it's imposed on somebody. And that's my concern with assisted suicide. There is no guarantees or assurances that people won't have it imposed upon them. So why contemplate it at all? People who are advocating for assisted suicide talk extensively about the need for safeguards, and they argue that safeguards are possible. And some people who are campaigning for assisted suicide even say, we will start from the basis of ensuring that we have safeguards, then we will implement the mechanisms, then we will have opportunities to review the assisted suicide mechanisms to ensure the safeguards continue and so on. For me, it's nonsense. You can't have safeguards to ensure that assisted suicide works in a very specific way, because there is no example in the world where safeguards have been implemented that has kept the criteria so strict and rigid that it remains on the basis of what was initially passed in legislation. There is always constant attempts to expand the criteria for assisted suicide. You look at all of the campaigners, even in the UK, many of the campaigners for assisted suicide would not be eligible under what has been presented to parliaments in the UK. So that would tell me that as soon as assisted suicide was passed, the continuation of the campaigns would remain, because you'd want to expand the criteria, broaden the parameters, so more people can be included. You also have concerns about the need for various levels of engagement by medical professionals to determine whether assisted suicide is appropriate or not. But we are talking about the involvement of professionals who are coming with their own subjective view on the basis of what is assisted suicide, is it acceptable within society? So this idea that you're going to have checks and balances of having 2 or 3 or multiple different individuals involved to determine whether it is appropriate or not for this individual to have assisted suicide is a flawed concept as well. Because if I wanted assisted suicide and I went to a doctor who was very sympathetic to me, chances are they will also be involved in networks with other doctors who are very sympathetic to assisted suicide. And there is examples across the globe where people have shopped around for finding the individuals who are best placed to process their appeal and their claim for assisted suicide. People would leave the health service because of the integration of assisted suicide legislation. You'll continue a crisis of healthcare provision, which will then place struggles on people who are trying to access services and not have their needs met. But it also means the next wave of people who come in will most likely have to accept the provision of assisted suicide. So culturally, you start to then see a shift in the way that you organize and the way that you deliver healthcare. The criminal justice systems and the systems of protection will be affected by assisted suicide legislation. You're asking people to determine is it a criminal act or is it not. And of course, you'll then have different perspectives in that as well, those who are sympathetic and those who are not. What I would say to people is, if you are wavering about your support for assisted suicide, but you're thinking that as long as the safeguards, I'll accept it, my argument is you'll never have a safeguard. So you either have to decide, do you accept the concept of assisted suicide in its entirety for everybody and for anyone in any background, or do you oppose it on the basis of this is not conducive to the way of organizing society? It's dangerous to make policy and legislation on the basis of individual experiences. You have to assess, what does this legislation and policy measure do for the reorganizing of society? What impact does this have on the way that we understand specific communities, understand the way in which we will organize our communities, the mechanisms we will put in place for people to live their lives in their communities? And assisted suicide will fundamentally reorganize the way in which we understand life and death, and the way we understand life and death for marginalized communities, like disabled people, and how we understand life and death for people who are struggling on a daily basis to access sufficient support. This is why there can never be a safeguard effective enough for assisted suicide to work, and this is why assisted suicide should never even be on the table for discussion. Because if you don't have accessible and inclusive societies, then why would you even be contemplating the idea of marginalized communities being exposed to assisted suicide? Often I hear people say, well, in the UK it will be different, we have a different culture, we are different politically, economically from those countries who have passed legislation. My argument is that I think that's quite indulgent. and it breeds that notion of exceptionalism. If we were to pass assisted suicide legislation, we will not be any different to any other country that has passed it. And what I would say is, if you look to countries that have passed the legislation, they have expanded the criteria. They have, in some certain situations, allowed and permitted people with mental health conditions to access it, children to access it, people in the criminal justice system to access it. So you have to accept that that is the trajectory that we will follow, because it's happening in other countries that have passed it. And when the data is telling us that in certain countries they consider it now to be a mess with assisted suicide, that it is undermining the foundations of the healthcare provision, undermining foundations of the criminal justice system. It is creating divergences within families and communities. We were not going to be surprised if this happens here, because there are so many voices that are telling us, please listen to the warnings and the concerns by international communities. There is, to my knowledge, no disabled people's organisation in the UK, or even across the globe, that actively supports assisted suicide. I think it's quite telling that you have bodies such as the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Disabled People, who have come out with strong reservations and concerns about assisted suicide mechanisms. And they place assisted suicide mechanisms within a broader level of concern about disabled people's exclusion. Disabled people struggle to access sufficient services to live a life. And I would say my interpretation is that they have argued that assisted suicide mechanisms are incompatible with disabled people's rights, because you can't have a program that is advocating for facilitating somebody's death whilst you're simultaneously trying to say disabled people's lives matter and they should be protected, and disabled people should be supported to have value and respect in their communities. I encourage people to look at the data, look at the literature around the concerns about assisted suicide, explore the views and perspectives from those who hold influential positions, such as the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Disabled People. Consider the views of disabled people's organisations who have come out strongly against assisted suicide, or who argue that assisted suicide is not a priority for disabled people's inclusion and participation in society. Communities such as disabled people and campaigners who are against assisted suicide and representative bodies like the UN are saying, pause and think about what sort of society you want to have across the globe. For me, the better way is to have a society that says all are welcomed, all will be supported, and all will be respected, where everybody's contribution is valued. And when you do that, you start to think about what is required from resources, what is required in terms of material, what is required in terms of people's attitudes, what is required legislatively and through policy-making processes, what's required to build accessible and inclusive and participatory societies. My view is that assisted suicide mechanisms don't have any place within the building and realising and the sustaining of accessible and inclusive and participatory societies. It's incompatible, so we need to remove it from the discussion, and we need to be thinking about what does appropriate palliative care look like when it's resourced and funded and available to people as their needs change. What sort of health service do we want to have where people don't feel ashamed or stigmatized about the way that their body functions, or the way that they understand their body in terms of the needs that they have and how to have those needs met. We want to have a society where the support that you require is available to you, and the support is predicated on the basis of having opportunities to contribute and be part of your community, whether that is through work, education, being part of the community dynamics in your local area. This is how you build a society which is better for people. Often when the people who are wanting to have their life ended are talking about the struggles that they experience. And those struggles are often the things that I've just talked about, the lack of infrastructure for support, the attitudes, the negative and the hostile attitudes that people experience, the lack of material protection that people have, such as accessible homes and so on. So we focus on that first, and then once we've realized accessible and inclusive societies, my assumption will be we'll no longer even need to debate the idea of assisted suicide. I'm not dismissing the voices of people who want to say, well, these are the things that I want assisted suicide. It's compassionate for me to listen to that, but it's also compassionate for me to raise my concerns and articulate an alternative, which is holistic palliative care that is funded, sufficient support for disabled people to live the life that they want, recognizing that people need to have opportunities to be part of their community as their needs change, and perhaps as their health declines, do the things that matter to them and that they have value of, and the relationships that they want to engage with. As somebody who engages with disability at all times, personally, professionally, academically, I would urge all politicians to reject assisted suicide proposals. They are dangerous, they are toxic, they will produce a society where disabled people and those with health conditions will struggle further to have their needs met, to have their right to life protected, and to have their claims met in terms of further protections and further amendments to live accessible and inclusive lives. Assisted suicide legislation and policy is a distraction to the existing social injustices experienced by disabled people. And I would encourage all politicians to focus your attention and your time and your energy and your knowledge on how to imagine and realize accessible and inclusive societies. And to do that, you focus on protecting rights, you focus on increasing opportunities to participate, and improving resources so people can have access to sufficient support to live the life that they want across their life course. And my argument is that at no point does assisted suicide help us to build accessible and inclusive societies.